Well, I think where I want to go next actually is back to that historical and social context of the Roman Empire in the first century. You'll all be familiar with that television program that is called Location, Location, Location. Well, in anything to do with the Bible, it's all context, context, context. And one of the things that distinguishes us from many previous generations is an awareness of the fact of these many different cultural contexts in which we live. I remember something like 30 years ago coming across a book by Charles Keating called Who We Are is How We Pray. And you could write a book today called Who We Are is How We Deal with the Bible. Because I think most of us take it for granted that we're not coming to the Bible in a vacuum, as it were. We're bringing something to the text. We're bringing our own life experience, our expectations, and for good or ill, that's likely to influence what we think we find there, if only because it determines the sort of questions that we ask. I think it's fair to say, it's a generalization, obviously, that men have a tendency to ask different questions than women. Children bring a different perspective again, and then the whole wider cultural environment in which we live also affects what we think we might find there. Now, we could go down a kind of hermeneutical rabbit hole on that one and ask how the intention of the author relates to the perception of the reader. And that's definitely a reasonable question. But I want to ask a different sort of question about the Gospel of Mark, because behind the language of authors and readers, there's an even more fundamental assumption, and that is the assumption that the Bible is a book. Now, of course, we all know it's not that simple, and we might qualify that by saying, well, it's actually a collection of many different books. But what about the very notion that it's a piece of literature, which brings with it a whole lot of baggage about what we're supposed to be doing with it? When you think about it, the reality is that our experience with the Bible, the fact that I can have one sitting in front of me and there it is in a book and I could open it and I could read it, is actually quite anomalous in the grand scheme of Christian history. The vast majority of Christians at all times and places have encountered the Bible not as literature and certainly not as something they might themselves read, but as story and therefore as performance. Now, in our own bit of the world, and increasingly we're discovering this is true also of East Asia, writing in some form first emerged more than 5,000 years ago with the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and so on. And they amassed vast libraries, famous libraries. So it's not too difficult for us to assume that their way of processing and sharing information wasn't too different from the media that we're familiar with today. Almost without thinking about it, we tell ourselves that their styles of writing might be primitive by today's standards. They wrote on clay tablets and painted pictures on walls. But apart from the materials they worked with, the authors of their works were doing pretty much the same thing as we do today with computers and printing press, weren't they? Well, actually, no. And it doesn't have anything much to do with their primitive writing materials. Because the reality is that the people who left us those kinds of archives were very much in a minority. They were the elites of their day. They were people with particular opportunities that often depended on their parentage, social standing, all this kind of stuff. But most people, for most of history, haven't been literate in the sense that we would understand it. And actually, until the invention of the printing press, there was little chance that they ever would be. It's easy for us to look at the archives of ancient Greece and Rome and imagine that by the time of the New Testament, things had changed. It's certainly the case that education was booming, and the schools of philosophers and rabbis and so on had no shortage of students. But as far as we can tell, and it's always a dodgy business trying to get statistics from 2,000 years ago, but as far as anyone can tell, even in this, what looks like a highly literate culture of ancient Greece and Rome, literacy was probably not more than about 10% of the population. And even then, for many people, being literate often seems not to have amounted to much more than being able to sign your own name. because most things that most people learned about was communicated to them orally. We see that in Paul's letters, for example, which we have them committed to writing, and they were committed to writing so that they could be communicated to communities far removed from where he was. But when they arrived at their destination, their recipients didn't read them because most of the recipients couldn't have read. They heard them. Paul actually gives instructions in several places that his letters were to be read out, that the recipients would hear them rather than read them. And at the beginning of Revelation, we have this remarkable statement that blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear. So if we take that seriously, the way we read the book of Revelation, we're not going to get any blessing from it, because we typically wouldn't hear the words read, and we certainly would be most unlikely to read them out aloud ourselves. But when you think about it, there was nothing unusual about that. Think about the Ethiopian whom Philip met traveling across the desert. They would never, ever have had a conversation if the Ethiopian had been doing what we do and reading it in our heads, as it were, silently. It was because he was reading it out aloud that the conversation happened. And much later on, Augustine has an interesting snippet of information that he once saw Ambrose apparently reading his Bible, but it was all in silence. And he couldn't understand why there were why he couldn't hear it, why Ambrose wasn't reading it out loud. So the least we can say is that these guys didn't read their Bibles the way that we do. And of course, we know that later on in the Middle Ages and onwards, people encountered the Bible not only by hearing it, but also by seeing it in depictions of stained glass windows and so on. The point I want to make is that the environment that produced the New Testament was, for all its literary prowess, essentially an oral culture. And that, I think, was especially true of early Christian culture. Remember that St. Paul points out that not many of you were wise, not many of you were influential or of noble birth. He could have added, not many of you know how to read and write either. So how do you learn anything in an oral culture? Well, to some extent, it depended on the nature of the information. In the Roman Empire, the communication of information by the civic authorities, governments at local as well as national and international level, was really important for the cohesion of society. And this was typically the job of messengers who operated, let's say, a bit like the town criers that we might be more familiar with. They were responsible for informing the general public of local and international news, and they operated throughout the empire. And then there was also what you might call non-official news and information, in the sense of non-governmental news. And this was transmitted by storytellers. There's loads of evidence of the different types of informal storytellers, not dissimilar to what we might find today. There were street performers, male and female as well, who were essentially what you might think of as entertainers, but the entertainment focused on their stories. There were definitely specialists in religious stories who might be attached to temples or synagogues, and some of them became quite famous. They were just so good at it that they had a reputation and became recognized figures in their own right. And then there were the informal but really influential storytellers, mothers and other women who told stories to children, either to socialize them or to frighten them, or sometimes both. So since storytelling performance was absolutely everywhere in the ancient world, we can be pretty sure that it would be an important part of early Christian experience. In this world, stories are handed on from one generation to another. They were learned off by heart as you heard them repeated, and in the process, they were often refined and expanded. Now, such stories could be written down, but the written versions stood alongside the spoken versions, and the storytellers regularly told their stories without any reference to, and sometimes without any knowledge of, the existence of written versions of them. We know for certain that such storytellers operated around the synagogues and the wider Jewish community, So I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption to suppose that this practice would be adopted among the first Christians as they heard and shared their own stories of Jesus. So this assumption that I'm making, that the Gospel of Mark is distinguished from Matthew and Luke by being rooted in the traditions of performative storytelling, also incidentally correlates with what we know of the circumstances in which the early Christians met and the shape of their gatherings. The evidence we have from other parts of the New Testament suggests that a typical first century gathering would take place in a tenement where the workshops were at street level and the workers lived on the upper stories in relatively constrained circumstances. And in that sort of informal atmosphere, that kind of environment favors storytelling as a mode of faith sharing rather than heavily structured upfront kind of gatherings such as we might know in our services today. And when you put that alongside the description that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 14 of a typical gathering in which all those present might have something to share and contribute, and put that alongside everything we know of the early Christian communities that suggest for the most part, not entirely, obviously, but most of them, by which we almost certainly mean 90% plus of them, were part of non-literate people groups who would have neither an interest in written texts nor the ability to either finance or their production or keep them in a safe place. The obvious conclusion to draw from the wider culture, quite apart from any insights from the New Testament itself, is that storytelling and performance would play a significant part in learning about Jesus. That's what Lorraine said in a much more interesting way, isn't it, a few minutes ago? But for how that might relate to our understanding of Mark, stay tuned, and we'll come to that shortly and later on.